So Nomi began her career on Wall Street, and you'll know now why I wasn't quite sure what she'd say to me. She ran the International Analytics Group as a senior managing director at Bear Stearns in London. She worked as a strategist at Lehman Brothers, as an analyst at Chase Manhattan Bank, and before leaving Wall Street, she was a managing director at Goldman Sachs. Today, she's a journalist, author, willing to, even dead in my house, and public speaker for focusing on the power behind our economic system and looking at ways local communities can make the economy work for them, like public banking, like the kind of thing you're talking about, Gar. In her most recent book, All the President's Bankers, which we also have for sale outside, and I'm sure Nomi would be happy to sign for you. It's a groundbreaking narrative about the relationship of presidents to key bankers over the past century and how this has impacted our country's domestic and foreign policy. Nomi has looked beyond the presidency in her earlier expose. It takes a pillage beyond the bonuses, bailouts, and backroom deals from Washington to Wall Street. Yeah. And she examines how corporations exercise power in her book, Other People's Money, The Corporate Mugging of America, which was chosen as a best book of 2004 by The Economist, Barron's, and the Library Journal. She's currently working on a book, Artisans of Money, exploring the role of central banks in the global financial and economic hierarchy. Nomi is a distinguished senior fellow at the nonpartisan public policy think tank Demos and has appeared on TV programs from Fox to BBC to PBC to Democracy Today. So Nomi, we're very glad you're here with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ruth is amazing. Everybody should know this. Those documents, the pamphlet, the magazine on public banking, she did that. So that's impressive. I want to talk a little bit about the fact that, and keying off of what Gar was talking about, the idea of power and money as being connected, because the axiom that is prevalent throughout Wall Street and the mega banks is, you know, if people in power stay in power. And of course, the corollary to that is people in power stay in power unless acted upon by an outside force. And the idea of taking control over our money and the decisions that get made and the places that it gets used and the capital that gets used is something that's very core to not just being in a democracy, but being a human. You know, we do live in a society where money is required to do things like pay rent, own a home, go to school, or go to university, a lot of it. You know, drive a car, everything that we do. And the reality is that in the wake of just the financial crisis component of how the system is completely screwed up, the big six banks in this country, which would be JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley, have increased the size of the deposits, i.e. the actual people's money that they hold, by 43% since the financial crisis. So they have become bigger in deposits. They've increased their asset size by 82%, so by almost doubling their asset size, right? But more than that, in addition to that, they control 97% of all the trading that banks do in this country in financial assets, so basically all of it. And they also control 95% of all the derivatives trading. So anything that's risky and dangerous is pretty much under their MO. Now, as we know, they had issues going into 2008, 2007. It didn't sort of become a crisis until the fall of 2008, but things were bubbling beneath the surface. Their reward for that was to be increased in size. The reward for that was to retain more control over the capital in this country. The reward for that was, in the case of, say, JP Morgan, Chase's CEO and chairman Jamie Dimon to get double, say 8-figure bonuses on an annual basis since the crisis. So they have no incentive to do anything about relinquishing their power, obviously. Now, on the other side of that, they are all criminals. From the standpoint of, well, from the actual standpoint of the legal settlements into which they have been involved on almost every practice, from mortgage lending to credit cards to foreign exchange rigging to LIBOR, I got that, to LIBOR rigging, to now credit default rigging. So basically anything in which they are involved, particularly on the riskier sides of how they use their capital, they have effectively, and the United States, these big 6 banks, more than even the global banks that were also involved to lesser extents in the financial crisis globally, they have paid $130 billion of fines. Now, $130 billion in fines, the amount of money that DC puts into banks is $2.2 billion. So basically, people who live for your money goes into sort of DC local, and $2.2 billion is allocated to various different banks. Now, $625 million, or almost a little bit more than a third, goes to Wells Fargo. That's a lot. And $2.2 billion, though, is only is a fraction of the $130 billion that the big 6 banks actually have been fined. So when we are talking about ripping out some of that capital that is going freely into the larger banks, predominantly into the larger banks, and since we were told this afternoon, 2008, a couple of the smaller local banks as well here, but the difference is 118 million to some of the smaller local banks, 118 million. The rest of 2 billion plus is going to larger banks, and about 1.3 billion of that's going to the big 6. 1% of the fines that they have had to pay, we are effectively funding, is one way to look at that. So when we talk about setting up a public bank, we're talking about taking a very small proportion to start with, before we have the whole revolution that Gar is talking about, and saying, look, we don't really want to be a part of the 97% trading assets. We don't want to be a part of the 95% derivatives. We don't want to fund speculation that provides zero value to us, and in fact that we pay for, so it is of negative to value to us. And the relationship with these banks that any of you might have if you're banking with them is also a negative relationship. If you have a deposit with a bank, you're paying them to keep your money. It is negative. Right now, there's a lot of talk about, are we going to negative interest rates from 0 interest rates? You are all at negative interest rate right now. So the issue is already worse than it's ever been. And that's why the necessity for change is greater than it's ever been. Because in the wake of the financial crisis, all of this has gotten worse. The capital allocations, the subsidization to these larger banks has all gotten worse than it was into that crisis. It's worse than it was in the 1920s when we had the 1929 crash, and then we were into the Great Depression, because at the very least during the Depression, and in 1933, there was a decision made here that we would at least segregate banks into speculative components and into the components that took our deposits and provided loans, whether they were for housing, whether they were for small businesses, whether they were for infrastructure development, but they provided loans, and that is what they did. And those two things under the Glass-Steagall Act in 1933 were separated. Now, in 1999, that was fully dialed back after a couple decades of chipping away at different components of it. And as a result, we had a lot of problems in the years since. We had a set of corporate bankruptcies fueled by these same big banks in the early part of the 2000s with Enron and with WorldCom and the different industries. And then we had the subprime crisis and the build-up to that crisis. And right now, we are in a crisis, because these banks are more top-heavy, they are more subsidized. And we have an added component from the standpoint of the Federal Reserve, who has funded effectively $4.5 trillion worth of this. Why? Because since they began their emergency measure, so we're now in the 7th year of this emergency measure, right? If this were like a fire, we would be gone, we'd be charred, there'd be like nothing left, right? So it's a 7-year emergency measure which has incurred a $4.5 trillion book of debt at the Federal Reserve. That they have funded these predominantly these same big 6 banks with actual money, actual capital they can actually use to do actual derivatives trades, and that money is not doing anything productive for anyone. So we had this conversation today, which went quite well as an initial conversation with the city council. But one of the questions that or one of the feelings that one of the individuals in the room suggested was that keeping money with some of these larger banks is actually less risky. But that's the perception. Why? Because they're on every corner. Why? Because they're FDIC insured, which they're not for. That wasn't the reasoning today. I mean, one could think that, but they're not for the kind of money that's being allocated by DC into some of these banks. So what's been happening is this $1.3 billion that's been allocated to just the big 6 banks that are the ones that are, have copped all of these settlements on all of their practices. They're in funds that are liquid, meaning technically at any point in time, if the city needs to if the district needs to get money out, they can. However, that money is not actually secure. That money is in things called money market funds. Money market funds fluctuate with interest rates. Money market funds in the height of the crisis in the early 2009 period were the thing that the Federal Reserve wanted to inject money into to keep them from dying. To keep them from going below $1, of sort of being dollar in, dollar out. And they were really struggling. So there are periods of crisis time where that money is not necessarily more secure. But what is secure is the knowledge that the money that is used for these different activities of banks goes beyond local development. They're all global banks. They all operate on a pan-market basis. They don't really care what happens here or anywhere else. They're not on a mission to develop infrastructure. They're not on a mission to have sustainable energy. They're not on a mission to stop wars. They're not on that mission. They're simply on a mission to move money in such a way that it makes them, for that quarter, for that bonus period, as profitable as possible. So the idea of a public bank is saying, look, we don't want to have all of our money in that game. It's really very simple. They are afraid to have some little teeny bit of that money chipped off into being used for us, being used for whatever the local purposes are. And it's like really, they're not actually scared because on a day-to-day basis it wouldn't really change their profitability, but the idea of chipping away at it is the problem, and that's why there's so much negativity, and that's why the idea of public banking is relegated to this sort of side thing that may or may not happen. The idea of public banking, though, really is just controlling capital. It's just controlling power over our own money into areas that we can actually deploy what we need to have deployed. When the Bank of North Dakota was created in 1919, it was created very much because North Dakota was not getting enough money coming out of the Wall Street Center at the time to fund what it needed to do within the state. And so it said, you know what, we have money we have revenues, we have taxes, we have collections within the state, and we want to be able to have autonomy over how that money gets used within the state. So we will have a public bank. And as was mentioned by Steve, the public bank ultimately, at the time, you didn't get multi-million-dollar bonuses, but today, almost 100 years later, that bank has a higher return on the capital that's in the bank than by double almost than a JP Morgan has. So it has zero trading percentage. It doesn't deal with sales of weird toxic securities. All it really does is contribute money back into North Dakota, and it uses the money that comes from North Dakota to work with community and local banks to help North Dakota. As a result, for example, students, which are about 30% of its portfolio, don't pay as much to go to university in North Dakota. So there's benefits on that long tail basis, just in terms of who's getting the money. Small businesses are about a third of that, whereas for the big 6 banks, their credit availability that they've done for small businesses has declined by 17%, even though they're all bigger. So the choices of how money gets used is also a way of retaining power. So it's all very connected. So extracting power and having a public bank simply gives us more autonomy and more choice. It's also less risky. It's also less wasteful of taxpayer money, because rather than subsidize Jamie Dimon's $20 million paycheck last year, which no one wants to do, I mean, like, the only people that want to do this are the board members that he basically selected that voted, to have him get that check. But real people, we don't want to subsidize that. So if you had a public bank with a board on top of it that's basically also accountable to where that money goes and how that bank does and where it actually helps the local community, then you also don't waste the excess money on someone's sort of ego or someone's sort of position in the hierarchy of like major CEOs in the country. So there's a lot of benefits, and as a locality, as a state, as a city, like there's no reason to not want that. So the issue is, from the standpoint of you who bank with some of these banks and also perhaps bank with some of the smaller banks, is to kind of start also that mentality from the ground up. The fact that you're here, the fact that this is like a full room is really cool. Because it means that you're concerned, I'm imagining, not just about starting a public bank, but by the message that sends and the autonomy that gives to you and your money. And that's huge. We should all want to do that. Because in the halls of Wall Street, at Goldman, at JP Morgan, at wherever, they're not sitting there figuring out how to, make it easier for anybody here. Nor are they trying to figure out or cop to the fact that it actually might even be less risky to do that. Instead, they have been subsidized by government policies, by poor regulations, by a Federal Reserve, by a Treasury Department who's issued debt in order to subsidize them. And for 7 years, they are still acting technically insolvently with all of our help, because without the continued support of the Federal Reserve for the larger banks at zero interest rates, at buying their securities, at helping them along, they would have tremendous problems. The market would have tremendous problems. That's why rates have been where they are for so long, not because it's necessarily helping the economy, but because it's helping these large, risky institutions that are also, in some cases, felons. So one of the things we need to do is say, look, Bank of North Dakota doesn't have these problems. It wasn't in the center of this. We can create a public bank with a mandate that actually makes money work for people, work for projects that are local, work for all the things that are necessary to create jobs, to have a sustained, stable economy from the ground level up, and to take some of that power back and take some of that money back to make it work for us.